So at the previous lesson, I asked you to install MySQL according to provided instructions, and the instructions are here. Download and install MySQL. A critical point that when you install it, do not do default install or install all. Just select custom install and select three items. This will be enough to run an example in our code. You need to select server, workbench, and connector J. Optionally, you can select documentation, so samples and examples, but it's not important. It is only if you want to go deeper and wider about it. So please, this was important to select custom install. I assume that you already installed it. It is just for a reminder if you didn't, so where to find the information. In the previous lesson, we discussed security settings with program StudentData2. We used the H2 database in all our previous programs because it was easy to do, doesn't require setup, doesn't require install, and it is a perfect choice if we need to debug something. But eventually we will need to learn how to use a server that is running as a service on some IP address, so our program connects to it, update data, and the data persists between program starting and shutdown. Because if we use in-memory database, data will be lost when memory is shut down, when a program is shut down and restarted, it will be brand new, empty database or with some default data in it. So let's consider that we have an imitation of real-life scenario, that we have a server running MySQL, and we need to set up our program so it connects to database on the server. When we use MySQL, we can use it in a similar way to H2, so we set up that data is fresh each time, and it is lost up at the second run, but perhaps for debugging, it is one of the scenarios, but we already did it with H2. So for MySQL, let's assume that we have imitation of real-life scenario. So this is persistent data on the server, and we want to preserve it. We don't want fresh start each time. So let's clone StudentData2 again program into separate folder. Why do I want to clone into a separate folder? The reason is that source code on GitHub does not contain configuration for IntelliJ. And when we clone it, we clone just source code. We won't have a copy of configuration for IntelliJ. For previous folder, for previous clone for StudentData2, we set up configuration for H2 database. When we switch branch to MySQL branch, it won't switch configuration because it's not part of version control system. I didn't add those configuration to version control system. So after switching the branch, we would have to switch settings of IntelliJ IDEA, which kind of messy approach, so I believe it's better just to have another clone that is set up for MySQL database. So if we want to use MySQL, we will use clone set up for MySQL. If we want to use H2, we will use clone set up for H2. So for this reason, let's clone this again. So I'm going to StudentData2 Spring Boot, and I will create another clone of this code in different folder, and that copy of the project will be set up for MySQL. So I click copy as usual, then I open IntelliJ and IntelliJ IDEA, and I select get from version control. It is your folder, not your folder, but folder where I keep your section stuff. Control V. And I want to create folder specific for the version with MySQL. So I added word MySQL to this. I think it is another 3 here, right? Yeah. I created a name of the folder so it is specific for MySQL setup. And I will just click clone and wait to what happens. So it is cloning the code. I select Trust Project and just waiting. By default, it opens main branch that it is set for H2 because it is default branch. This is the reason. It's still building. So when I open resources, you will see that it still have files to create brand new database each time in the memory. And in application properties, there is a settings for H2 database. So when I switch branch to using MySQL server, so I select MySQL server checkout, you will see that these settings now about MySQL. And also, this is a MySQL dialect, MySQL driver, and this is location. This is the port running MySQL, default port running MySQL server on the local host. And this is name of the database in MySQL server. What is these two pieces? Username and password. By the way, password is bad. Don't use it. It is just for simple scenario because it's a demo. It's not real life application. So what is user and CSM password? This username has nothing to do with users of this program, like Bart Simpson, Homer Simpson, Lisa Simpson. This user is created or will be created on MySQL server for your program to log in into it. Okay. So in order for your program to connect to SQL server, it needs to know some username and some password in order to connect to it. Right? But it is not root. When you installed MySQL, you were asked to provide password, and this will be root password for your MySQL server. This is not root, and this user doesn't exist by default. SD2, it is StudentData2. So SD2 user doesn't exist by default. So in order to make this program work, we need to create this user. Why do we need to create this user? Why root is not good enough? The reason why root is not good enough is that security. Security is the reason. A typical scenario for security setup is to provide access on as needed basis. A root user has access to all databases on the server. But our program doesn't need to have access to all databases running on this data server. It needs to have access to specific database. That is about student data. Database for this program. So just for good security practice, we create users that will have access only to specific features used by the given program. But only for specific database only to specific database used by the program. Okay. So it is for security reasons to provide access on as needed basis, not to everything. Okay. So by default, of course, it doesn't exist. We need to create it. Also, when we look up resources, these two files use it to create database and populate it with starting data. I removed them because we will set up MySQL database with already some data in it, and it won't be refreshed each time when we start the program. What else is different? Obviously, settings for the program libraries used by the program are also different, because instead of H2 library, it is using MySQL library, right? Where it is, in build Gradle, I change it for this particular branch, I change it H2 to MySQL connector J. How do I know what to change? I created an empty project with selecting MySQL database and compared this file in the generated project with the files that already have. And this is only line that is different. So I copy pasted this into branch in the code branch that is using MySQL. So that is the approach. If you don't know library name, just generate project with this with check marks for that you want, and copy paste this library into the branch that is using it. All right. So this is our obvious differences, and there is no other differences. Also, a data source is not set up, and let's set up data source when we already have database. All right? Because by default, our MySQL server is brand new. We installed this at the previous lesson or between lessons. So let's open MySQL Workbench. So going to MySQL Workbench, it's a GUI to connect to MySQL. So I select all apps, and I browse for MySQL folder. In MySQL folder, there is a MySQL Workbench 8. So I click on that, and by default, it will open like this with previously set up connection to your server running on localhost. When you click on this box, it will ask you to provide login and password. Login is root, and password, it is the password that you type it when you install the server. And it will be a checkbox, a remember me checkbox. If you select remember me, it will not ask you to re-login each time. This is what I did. When I was logging in first time, I selected remember me. So when I click on this box, it's not showing me login and password box because it remembers my previous login. All right. And when it opens for you first time, you will not see StudentData2 database here. You will see only sys, and if you optionally install it sample databases, you will also see Sakila and Word. But we're not going to use it in this course. It is only if you want to practice with SQL. You can later install it with installer if you want, but I'm not using it. So by default, it will show just sys. In order to start from the same point as you, I will delete this database, so it will be exactly similar starting point. All right? How to delete database? You move mouse on top of it, and right-click and select drop schema. Schema, it is database. Drop schema and select drop now. And it is gone. Okay? But it is not clean up. Remember that my program also needs user to log in. And at the previous lesson, in another section, I already created this user. So in order to start from the same point, I need to delete that user specifically created for my StudentData2 program to log in into MySQL database. So way to do it. I'm going to administration, and I select users and privileges. I click that SD2 user that I created previously. Now I want to delete it. So I click delete, and now click delete, and it's gone. Please notice that user that I created for my program to connect to MySQL is separate from SQL database that I created for my program. This user has privilege to access it, but it is, if I delete database, it doesn't delete user. As you saw, I deleted database, but user lives separately, right? Because it's a separate entity, you can configure created user to connect to have a privilege to access to several databases. So user is separate from database. So if you want to do clean start, you delete database and you delete user that you created specifically for your program. Questions? So I just showed up cleanup, and now let's. So we can close this stuff. I click schemas, and now it is not here. The database is gone. User is already deleted. So let's initialize SQL path, server path, using necessary ways so our program can start, right? I post some files on Slate, so it is in week 6 folder. StudentData2 MySQL files. This is a zip file that contains 2 files in it. It contains configuration file for for application properties, this configuration file. And this configuration file is already here. You don't need to copy paste it. It's already in the code. And this zip folder contains SQL file. So please download it and unzip it, and I'm interested in SQL file posted there. Okay? Unzip it and make sure you know where it is. Once you see this SQL file, do not double-click it. Do not. Because if you double-click it, it will open it here, but you will not be able to run it. Run button will not work. It will stay disconnected from the server. All right? So just unzip it and know where you unzip it. You don't double-click. Okay? Please download it and unzip it. Okay? And know where it is. Now I need to open this file using open button here. See, open, it is second button from here, open. And I'm browsing to the folder where I unzipped this. For me, it's week 8 in this folder, and I selected. Okay. Again, I repeat, it doesn't have to be, you have to browse for it, not double click. And click open. Now let's see what is inside of it. Create database StudentData2. So I'm creating database. In H2, it was default name for the database, so we were creating tables in default name. In this case, we provide name because it's a server, it needs to be provided. Okay? Then use StudentData2, it is shortcut, so I don't have, after saying use StudentData2, I don't have to prefix any table name with StudentData2. So student table will be assumed that it belongs to StudentData2. And create student table, it will be assumed that it is created in StudentData2 database. Okay? So it's a shortcut to assume that all tables that I'm naming after that belongs to StudentData2 database. Okay? Are you with me at this moment? Okay. So creating table, is this table exactly the same as before? No difference. Then I'm creating table to store user name and password, the same as before. Creating table to store roles, ID and role name. Creating table to map users to roles. Since it is many-to-many mapping, we need to have additional table for that. So ABP user role, and I have user ID, role ID, 2 columns that will connect these 2 pieces to say that this user has given role. And this persistence logins table is used on the server side to store data associated with remember me cookie inserted into browser. So while you have remember me cookie in the browser, it won't ask you to relog in. So this is copy-pasted from documentation. Most of this feature about remember me cookie, it is just coming by default from from security feature of Spring Boot. Now I'm populating student data table with fake data as before, but this data will not be refreshed between program runs because it is just done once, right? I'm creating users as before. I'm associating first two users like adults, March and Homer, with role 1, and it is admin, and kids with role 2, it is just role user. But this is completely new. So far, it was exactly the same, except I created database explicitly, StudentData2, right? But what is this one? This line is creating SD2 users that I just deleted, right? So line 77 is creating SD2 user that can log in from localhost, it means from the same computer, using password Sesame. Again, bad password, don't use it in real life scenario, but it's a demo. Okay? But this user by default doesn't have a privilege to read any data or write any data by default. So we need to give this privilege for the user to have access to everything in StudentData2. Technically, it doesn't need to create tables because tables are already created, but I just copy-pasted everything. We can just remove create and drop because it's not, this user is not creating tables and not removing tables. But I just gave it everything. Okay. All privileges to given database. Okay. To SD2 user localhost. Please notice that this file cannot be run multiple times unless you wipe off data from SQL Server. Because you cannot create database with the same name if it already exists. It is the first line of the code. And also, you cannot create user with the same name as if it exists. Right? So you cannot run it multiple times. This is why I wipe it off, all this data, so I can run it in front of you. How to run it? There is a run button here that says execute highlighted portion of the code or everything. Okay. So I click this and it executes everything here. Okay. Including creating user table, user login, right? SD2 user. Next. Typical mistake with similar code. What happens? Sometimes students make mistake, and this is quite common. So this is why I'm warning you, if you play with this code, that it's easy to make this kind of mistake. What is the mistake? First of all, this is not mistake. I just want to refresh this window. This window is not refreshed automatically. So you need to refresh it in order to see tables. Okay. So what is mistake? For example, student is working on own database and decided that this table that is created is not good enough. It needs to be replaced. So what is the scenario? Student is deleting database, and technically database is gone, so this code can run up to the point which is here, right? So this script will fail at this moment. So it will recreate database up to this point. All right? And this line will show error, and user will not be recreated because user already exists. Okay. All right? So one scenario that fails is to delete database, do not delete user. It looks like fine, you already have this user. What's the problem? Why do you need to recreate it? The problem is this one. Why? Because when you delete StudentData2 database, this part won't survive. It means your previous user doesn't have access to your newly created database. All right. So in order to make it work, you have to highlight this part and run this one. Okay. All right. So bottom line, if you don't want to delete user after deleting database, which is fine, you run this code and it will fail at this moment because user already existing. Okay? Cool. But you have to, after this, you have to highlight this one and run it. Because instructions for given user do not survive after deleting database. So they will not be applied automatically to the database of the same name, created after that. All right? So this is a quite common mistakes when students work on any project or any, so students assume that after recreating database, since you already ran this for the user, user will keep this privilege. No. This privilege is gone after deleting database. You have to reapply it. Okay? So how to see content of the tables? One, it is brute force. You browse database, you will see tables, you click on table, and move mouse on little icon with the table on it, click on it, and it executes query. So this will be content of the table. Or you can type any query what you like and execute the query. You can have as many tabs as you like. You click another tab, they click type query, execute it, and you'll have any result of the query showing up. So this is how to see data using GUI with MySQL. So now we have a database, so our program can connect to it. So let's go back to our program in IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate. We can click run and it will work. But before clicking run, let's browse the code and see what IntelliJ tells us. So I'm going, for example, to Java, data, GPA section, and students entity GPA. Please notice that student table is highlighted because IntelliJ doesn't know if this table exists or not. So it gives you a warning. Maybe this table doesn't exist. The same about columns. ID, first name, last name. It doesn't know if these columns are present in the given table, and it doesn't know if this table is on the server. So it is just warning to you because IntelliJ IDEA doesn't have this information. Is it right code or is it wrong code? We know that it's right because if we run, it will work, right? But IDE doesn't know it. You can provide extra information to IDE so it can help you better, so it can validate your code. How to do it? You set up data source. So you either click here and wait, assign data source, or you click plus, click data, database, and click plus, and add data source to it. Okay? So it's up to you which approach. Okay, plus, say data source, and now you select MySQL. And now you select what your data server running locally. So it is localhost, user password login. User, when I do SD2 user, it doesn't have all options. So in this setup, I use root. And I don't think it's a security issue because it stays on your laptop, the same as your server, right? But SD2 user, it goes with your code, compiled code, to where it is, will be eventually posted. Right? So for this window, while you do development, I use root. So I use root and password what I typed when I was installing the server. Okay. After this, we can type database name is StudentData2 and test connection. When you test connection, it will tell you that driver is not installed. Do you want to install it? You click OK, and it will be installed. So it's not a big deal. Okay. But I already did it once, so this is why it says successful. If it says successful, just click OK, and it will show here in databases, data sources. When you click on this angle, it will not show tables by default. I don't know why, but you need to refresh it, and it will show. Okay. Click refresh button, and it will show tables from the database server. Now it knows that it has tables, and it knows which columns every table has. So it can validate your code against tables and columns on actual database running. All right? Now, if you go to any entity, and if it still shows yellow, you can assign given data source to it. Assign data source, select data source, localhost, you see? And after this, it will be happy, because now it knows this data source contains table app role, and app role contains such columns, so it can validate your columns in the code. Okay. So this setup is optional, but it is necessary if you want IDE to be nice to you. So it will help you and will give you warning if something is mistyped, for example. Okay. Also, you can use IDE to see real content of the database as it goes. So once you set up database on MySQL, you don't need this window anymore, although you can use it instead of IntelliJ IDEA. But IntelliJ IDEA itself can display data from the database because it has built-in GUI features for database connections. How to do it? It comes with console where you can type database queries and see results, like command line. It's one approach. Easiest is just to double-click table name, and it will come up with content. This is not refreshed automatically. In order to refresh, you click refresh button, so to see current content. It will re-execute query. All right? So this is real data from real server, and since server is running independently from our program, it's not in memory, we can see real state. Previously, it was a big issue with H2 database, because this part was fake copy of something that will be created in H2 database in memory of the program. This is why when you use H2, this part is not real data. It is fake copy for your program, for IntelliJ to validate your code. But when you use actual database server that is running independently from your code, it is actual data. For H2, it is impossible to do because H2 in memory available only when your code is running. But when you develop your code, it's not necessarily running because you type your code, right? So for this reason, it's more complicated in H2. But H2 is easy in terms of setup, and each time you have fresh data, you don't need to run servers separately. So it is good for testing and debugging, but this can be also used for testing and debugging, but requires more setup. So let's run this program and see if it's actually doing something. So it started, and I'm going to localhost 8080. OK. And if I can log in, it means I do have database connection, because login information is coming from the database. So if I cannot log in, it's probably because I cannot connect to database. So here it is. I could log in, so database connection is working. So let's add some data and see if it's updating. Student data, add student, so some data. I add my name and some engineering technician, second year, and with our program sent, and this data is added. List students, I see myself here. But please notice that this is not refreshing automatically. I need to click refresh button in order to see current data. So I click refresh button, and you see it shows the data. Okay. You can sort it by clicking this tab. It will sort. By default, it is sorting by ID. The same as here. This table is not where it is. This table is not refreshed automatically. You need to click refresh in order to see the recent data. I don't know how to zoom this part. It's tiny. I assume that you have it in front of you, so you can read it. So this was the introduction, how to use MySQL with program that is updating data, reading data from. So as you see, it's not very different from H2, just a little bit different setup.